Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 59. Birds of a Feather. Any info on hawks? They asked bluntly as they walked over to Eraserhead. Eraser had long since gotten used to their non-greeting, so he answered without hesitation, like they'd already been talking. Not much. He's ranked pretty high, but I'm sure you found that out yourself. He's not affiliated with an agency like me. He works freelance with the police, which is strange for a limelighter, but I assume he's just trying to avoid falling into the sidekick rut for the rest of his career. It's an unorthodox approach, but it seems to be working for him. They responded with a hum and sat down with their food. Eraser seemed convinced that there was nothing off with him, but they could see through the cracks in the facade. Hawks was afraid of something. They knew it. They just didn't know why. Eraser was right about one thing, though. None of the information or lack thereof was overly suspicious. Nothing pointed toward ill intent, and Ivy could think of at least 1,000 ways that his quirk could be useful. From simple surveillance to a full-on raid, depending on his limits, Hawk could do it all. Together they could get this supplier out of the equation and his gear out of their streets. However, if they were going to do that, it would require Ivy to give him some trust. They very much did not want to do that. The kids seemed off tonight. They weren't usually one to exchange pleasantries, but they had been here for at least 15 minutes, and they hadn't said anything even mildly sarcastic or insulting. They just sat down and ate their food. He knew they wouldn't respond to him without their mask on, so there was no use in asking until they finished, but they were taking their time. He could hear them pushing their food around, and when they finally handed it back, it felt just as heavy as when he handed it to them. He'd brought the same thing yesterday, so he knew it wasn't because they didn't like it. Well, maybe he didn't know that for sure. The kid never complained about anything he gave them. You want to take this home? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Guess I just wasn't that hungry. Sorry. They mumbled as they stared out over the city. You all right, kid? He asked. They breathed in and let out a heavy sigh before answering. Yeah, I'm fine. We need to get in contact with Hawks. You were right. Nothing points toward ill intent, and if he's going to be snooping around here, I'd rather he do it when we are here to keep an eye on him. They were deflecting the question. They seemed tense. There was an irregular tightness to their shoulders, and their stance was too stiff. Something was off, but he couldn't imagine anything good would come from pushing the question. All right, so you want to invite him over for a patrol? 3 people is a bit much, don't you think? He asked. He had only ever patrolled with a partner or solo. Trying to coordinate with a third person sounded like too many cooks in the kitchen. Well, you're free to leave, but I still don't trust him, so I'm not letting him fly around my streets without my supervision. They shot back. He just rolled his eyes. All right, tell Sukashi. I'm sure he can pass the message along. They let out a defeated sigh, even though it was their suggestion, and started typing away on their phone. I told him to meet us on the roof of the apartment building on block 28 in an hour. He is not allowed to warm up with us, Shota teased as he got up to stretch. Ivy just shot him a look and started running through their own stretching routine. 45 minutes later, they were stood together on the rooftop on block 28, waiting with their eyes trained up at the night sky. It didn't take long until they heard the telltale whoosh of large wings displacing the air around them. Hey, guys, Hawks greeted cheerfully as he touched down on the rooftop. Evening, Eraser greeted back. Ivy simply nodded. So what's the plan? Where are we headed? We've got a set patrol route that we're following tonight, so just follow our lead and stay in sight. But first, May I see a feather? Ivy requested. What? They held out their hand expectantly. You can control them, right? Uh, yeah, I can, he replied as a small feather hesitantly shot out from his plumage and over to Ivy. When it reached them, they put their hand up, signaling for Hawks to stop and leave it hovering in front of them. Then they looked to Eraser and gave the signal they used for him to activate his quirk on someone. He gave a disappointed look and rolled his eyes, but acquiesced, and the feather started drifting downward into Ivy's hand. Hawks looked startled at that, but he didn't make a move to say or do anything about it. Can you move them? No, clearly not, he said, frowning. Your wings, Hawks. Ivy clarified. Oh. No, I can't, he replied with a grimace. Eraser dropped his quirk, and immediately the feather in their hand darted back to Hawks, who was shaking out his wings like a limb that had fallen asleep, and doing his best to repress a shudder. So your quirk is primarily a specialized form of telekinesis with a secondary mutation. Interesting, Ivy surmised aloud as they pulled out a pocket-sized notepad and started writing. They could feel eyes on them, but they paid them no mind. Why exactly are you taking notes on me? Hawks asked cautiously. Trust me, it's more for your benefit than it is for mine. Prove yourself trustworthy, and you can have them, they chirped as they glanced up with a self-satisfied grin. We constructing new hazing rituals now? Eraser quipped. Sure, you want me to rip you a new one too? Ivy shot back without missing a beat. Like you ever miss an opportunity to insult me anyway. It's my love language, they mumbled as they continued to scribble furiously on the tiny notepad. How touching, he replied dryly. Fire. Stay away from fire, they said, looking up at Hawks as they concluded their first notes. All right, let's go, they said, moving on without elaboration on the ominous tip. Noted, Hawks remarked with a slightly furrowed brow. Without waiting for confirmation from anyone, they ran to the ledge and jumped off, landing in a roll on the building next to it. They heard Hawks let out a surprised noise as Eraser touched down next to them. This guy was freaking Kago out. They'd been hostile since he first showed up on the scene, which he will admit he did not do with much grace, but still, give a guy a chance, right? He was quite surprised to hear from the detective that Ivy had requested his presence. He was half convinced that the vigilante would kill him on sight if he stepped foot on their streets again, but here he was on a personal invite, and they were taking notes on him, which was interesting. Eraser was here too, thankfully. He wasn't much less off-putting, but at least he didn't look like he wanted to stab him. Plus, he was a hero, which gave a little more reassurance that he was a law-abiding citizen who wouldn't take him out like a rabid territorial animal. Okay, maybe that was dramatic, but Ivy gave him the heebie-jeebies. They looked at him like they were looking into his very soul, and they didn't like what they saw. The two of them fell into their practiced banter, and it put him more at ease. He wished he had someone like that. The two seemed so familiar with one another, and that only came more apparent as the night went on. They moved together with a synchronicity that they had clearly been building up for ages. They ran around as a perfect unit, throwing signals back and forth to one another that meant nothing to Kago. They clearly didn't need him here, but he helped where he could. Neither of them handled things to standard protocol, and he found himself very grateful for it. He knew what it was like to have nothing to your name, and they clearly had empathy for that. They were good people. Eraserhead was handing out nutrient packets to hungry beggars, and Ivy was pointing lost or inebriated wanderers in the right direction, and they both paused toward the end of their patrol to walk the ladies of the night home safely. They didn't find any more information on the support gear case, but Kago wasn't even upset about it. He had a nice night, and he hoped that he would be invited back again. Those two yapping at each other had him holding back laughter all night, and there were a lot of people who needed help around here, so he wanted to stay as long as he could have a viable excuse to give to the commission. Hawks stayed in his lane the whole night. He observed more than anything, but helped when he could, and he didn't comment or try to stop them running this place the way they did. By the end of the night, his smile actually seemed genuine. All right, Hawks. What do you think about this case then? We've seen your casework, but I want to hear it from you, Ivy asked as they were wrapping up patrol. Oh, sure. Yeah. I caught wind of the case when he was selling to people in Tokyo. It was a small operation at the time, but he always used third-party sellers. Me and all the other heroes in Tokyo were keeping a pretty good eye on it, so things didn't spread too far. I think that's probably what drove him down here. So, sorry for that, I guess. He laughed awkwardly as he rubbed the back of his neck. I knew he was still in business, that he was exporting somewhere else, but we didn't have enough evidence to search him or his properties. Well, until you two saw him that night, I assume he's laying low at a temporary location until he can rebuild a new base of operations. Oh, oh, dang it, that made sense. They were so caught up on hawks poking around their city that they didn't even stop to think about where the supplier ran off to. If Uptown is his main buyer, it would make sense for him to retreat here among allies. And there certainly wasn't a lack of places to set up shop for a while. The warehouses were like hermit crab shells for criminal operations, vacant and unsupervised, with a plethora of shapes and sizes to suit anyone's needs. One would think they'd learn their lesson and keep a closer eye on where they actually lived, but there was just so much going on, and Ivy, Eraser shouted as he snapped his fingers in front of their face. They immediately slapped his hand away and shot him a glare. Don't look at me like that. You're the one staring off into the distance and muttering in tongues or some shit. What's going on? He snipped back at them. Nothing. I need to look into something. It might be nothing. They dismissed. Hawks was glancing back and forth between them again, but he didn't look as uncomfortable as he had at the beginning of the night. Maybe he was getting used to their BS. Anyway, it's too bad we didn't get any more info on the case, but I'd be happy to tag along with you guys again. I have a feeling that things are going to start up again soon. You two threw a wrench into their plans, and they're probably still scrambling to get things back to the way they were, but that won't last forever, he warned. Yeah, you're right. Meet us same time, same place, tomorrow. And Hawks, this is for you, they declared as they passed him the notepad they'd been scribbling on all night. Several of the small pages were filled with neat kanji. As he flipped through the pages, he was shocked. He had answered a few miscellaneous questions that Ivy asked him throughout the night, but this was simultaneously the most concise and in-depth analysis of his quirk that he'd ever gotten, and the commission had given him several. Hawks, name unknown, age 21, agency non-applicable, quirk Fierce Wings. Fierce Wings is a telekinetic quirk that allows its wielder to control each feather of their wings, a secondary mutation of the quirk. The user can individually control feathers simultaneously to a large and unknown range. User can control each feather down to a molecular level. He is capable of hardening them by not allowing the particles to be moved, meaning that the feather no longer has its usual flexibility and give, while still retaining its mass and density. Potential for user to use feathers as knives or swords. Very accurate projectile weapon. The user can feel feathers even when disconnected from their body, meaning they can sense vibration of speech as well as air disturbances caused by movement. Ideal for surveillance. Feathers are capable of lifting many times their weight and even more than the user themselves could lift on their own. Limits are unknown, but presently the heaviest weight attempted is about half a ton per feather. Other feathers do not suffer if one is carrying more. Rescue potential can evacuate civilians extremely fast. Lost or damaged feathers regrow in a few days, depending on their size and the amount of feathers lost. Therefore, taking out his feathers will make him an easy target. Fire is his biggest weakness, as it would be able to destroy many feathers very quickly. Try coating feathers in some flame retardant. Testing required. Current costume is an aviator jacket, cargo pants, goggles when in flight, and a black shirt. Casual and approachable, good for public relations, but it's too unremarkable to be iconic. It doesn't look like a hero's suit. Add embellishments, logo to shirt, maybe in gold, and replace goggles with a visor completely see-through so eyes are still visible. Makes more approachable. He never thought about using his feathers as knives or swords. That could be really useful if he started to run low on usable feathers or just for close quarter fighting in general. And how had no one ever thought of a flame retardant coating? That seemed so obvious. Fire was always his biggest weakness there. Had to be something that could help that, right? And he had never even thought about how he could make his feathers harden like that. He never thought to question it, but that made sense. He had to put more focus into the control of his feathers when they were hardened. Most of it was stuff he already knew, but he was amazed that Ivy had sussed it out so accurately and even pointed out things he had never thought of after just one night of watching him and a few questions here and there. It was also a bit off-putting to know that they knew that they could just bust out a flamethrower and end his whole career, especially with how much they had seemed to not want him here before. He was speechless. He looked back up to Ivy like a gaping fish. It's a bit surface level. I have more critiques on your public image, but that seemed a little too rude to tell someone you hardly know. They added when he looked up at them. What? He spat out dumbly. Eraserhead was looking at him with a raised brow, and he reached out his hand in a silent request to see what they were talking about. In hindsight, he probably shouldn't have given a notebook telling anyone how to take him down over so easily, but it's not like Ivy couldn't just tell him anyway, nor did he think Eraserhead would use it against him, so he figured it would probably be fine. Your public image, how you present yourself, your persona, and how it all ties together with your skills and rank. You're looking to climb the ranks, aren't you? It seemed a little too personal to critique that, but I can if you want me to. Ivy elaborated. This guy was very odd. They didn't want to be rude. They looked ready to slit his throat during their first meeting, and they weren't much better at the beginning of the night. They didn't seem to give a damn about what Hawks thought of them as long as he was threatened by them. But now they didn't want to be rude. And they just gave him 2 new tips they would have never thought of and explained how he did things he had already been doing. And for what? Just because? Sure. I don't mind. You gave me some pretty good tips already. I can swallow my pride if you've got more to share, he said confidently, but in reality he was a bit scared of what they were going to say. He really just offered himself up on the metaphorical chopping block. Ivy looked hesitant for the first time since he'd met them, but they continued anyway. Your skills aren't enough to get you up in the ranks. They're a good jumping off point, but getting into the top 50 is all about marketing. You need to act more confident. Waiting around to see who's in charge isn't going to get you far in the ranks. If you want to be number 1, you've got to act like you're number 1. A little bit of cockiness will get you far, but if you go overboard, you'll just look like an a-hole, so be mindful of that. Acting like a narcissist won't get you anywhere, but confidence is sexy and sex sells. Lean into that. You're young and conventionally attractive. Get an agent to get you in contact with modeling or brand deals. The more people see you, the more people recognize you, the more they trust you, and your higher your rank goes. The casual look is good approach, but you need to be suave enough to not just look like a bum. That's why Eraser here isn't even on the board. They poked. Eraserhead looked back up from the notes and pulled a face at them. You're like 2/3 my age. I don't need your commentary on my sex appeal or lack thereof, he quipped as he handed the notebook back to Kago. He couldn't force back a laugh this time. Their banter was so endearing. He wanted to be part of it, and Ivy was right. He could use a little more confidence. Oh, come on, I wouldn't be so critical, he said as he shot a suggestive wink over to Eraserhead. Ivy immediately burst out laughing and made a few fake puking noises as Eraserhead mumbled something along the lines of, "Oh, Kami, I can't handle two of you," under his breath. Kago let out a full-bellied laugh at that, and Kami, did that feel good. Eraserhead seemed to have had enough of them because he rolled his eyes and swung away without any sort of goodbye, while they both laughed at his expense. When they got their cackling under control, Ivy gave them a mock salute and similarly threw themselves over the ledge of the roof they were perched on without a proper goodbye, leaving Kago to wonder what the hell just happened. Izuku's opinion of Hawks had changed very quickly. He acted like someone who didn't think they belonged there, and Kami, did Izuku know what that felt like. He was kind to everyone he talked to. He handed out 2 protein bars to people rifling through dumpsters, and he was actually pretty funny. He couldn't help but wonder why Hawks was still so scared, why he held back so much of himself. He had the perfect quirk. He was nice and funny, but Izuku figured he didn't know anything about his personal life. Maybe he'd just been through the ringer. As the laughter and camaraderie of the night faded, Izuku's mind drifted back to Shinso. It seemed like such a childish thing to worry about in the wake of his work in Uptown, but he couldn't help it. He wandered around random streets for a while just in case Hawks was tailing him. He didn't think he would. He had no reason to, but he'd figured he'd be better safe than sorry. When he finally got back to his stairwell, DJ was curled up on his pillow, waiting for him. Little shit, getting her dirty paws all over his pillow. It was a good thing she was too cute for him to be mad at her, so he just shooed her away and smiled as she grumpily stalked over to her favorite blanket and curled back up. He checked his phone, but Shinso still hadn't texted him. He wasn't surprised by that. He scrubbed away his eyeshadow as sadness rested its familiar weight back onto his bones, like he was shrugging on an old, heavy winter coat, one that was worn and coming apart at the seams, but still fit him perfectly. It always seemed to fit him perfectly, no matter how much time had passed. End of chapter.